Hey guys, tonight we're going to spend some time with one of the simplest things human beings ever made, and one of the most important. Bread looks ordinary when it sits on a table, but behind that ordinary shape is a very long history of experiment, hunger, patience, and skill. It is a story about how people learned to live with the land, how they turned fragile grains into reliable food, and how a humble loaf came to carry the weight of entire civilizations. And before we begin, if you enjoy calm, carefully told history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they can keep finding these slower, more thoughtful journeys into the past whenever a new one arrives. To understand the history of bread, we have to begin long before bakeries, long before ovens lined city streets, and long before anyone would have recognized a loaf in its modern form. The story starts in a world where food was uncertain, where survival depended on close observation, and where the difference between nourishment and starvation often came down to whether people could make use of the tough, stubborn plants growing around them. Wild grasses did not offer themselves easily. Their seeds were small, dry, and protected by husks. Collecting them took time. Processing them took effort. Eating them raw was possible, but not especially pleasant. And yet, across thousands of years, human communities kept returning to these grains because they stored well, traveled well, and, most importantly, could sustain life when other foods disappeared. Long before agriculture, hunter-gatherer groups in different regions were already gathering wild cereals and grinding them into coarse meal. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were pounding and crushing grains tens of thousands of years ago. That matters because it reminds us that bread was not suddenly invented in one dramatic moment. It emerged slowly from repeated habits. First came the collecting of seeds, then the grinding of them with stone, then the mixing of crushed grain with water. At the beginning, this would have produced something closer to a paste or porridge than to bread as we know it. But even that was a breakthrough. Grinding made grain easier to digest. Mixing it with water made it more versatile. Heating it on hot stones or in ash could turn it into a simple flat cake. This was one of humanity's earliest acts of food transformation, taking something hard, dry, and seasonal, and converting it into something portable, edible, and filling. That early step sounds modest, but it changed the relationship between people and plants. A gathered seed is one thing. A food system built around seeds is another. As communities became more familiar with grasses like wild wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, and with other grain crops in other parts of the world, they began to organize more of life around the harvest, storage, and preparation of grain. Bread, in its earliest forms, was not only food. It was a sign that people had learned to delay consumption, to plan ahead, and to invest labor into future security. Grain had to be cut, dried, threshed, winnowed, stored, and guarded from moisture and pests. Then it had to be ground, often by hand, every single day. Behind every simple cake of bread was a chain of effort so long that it quietly reshaped family life, work rhythms, settlement patterns, and social hierarchy. With the Neolithic Revolution, this slow experimentation became something much larger. Agriculture did not simply provide more grain. It created the conditions for bread to become central to daily life. Once people began cultivating wheat and barley intentionally, they could produce food in quantities that supported larger populations. Villages expanded. Permanent homes became more common. Storage pits and granaries appeared. The grinding stone became one of the most familiar tools in domestic life. Bread now moved from occasional preparation to a regular staple. In practical terms, this meant that a large share of daily calories in some societies came from grain foods. In cultural terms, it meant that bread, or foods very much like it, became woven into ideas of household order, hospitality, and survival. The ancient Near East gave bread one of its earliest great homes. In Mesopotamia, grain agriculture supported some of the world's first cities, and bread was part of the economic and ritual fabric of those societies. Workers could be paid in grain or bread. Temples managed stores of cereals. Administrative records tracked food with astonishing seriousness because food was power, and grain was the most manageable form of it. Bread in this world existed in many forms, from rough everyday loaves to more refined preparations. What mattered most was not just taste, but reliability. Bread made agriculture portable. It turned harvests into rations. It allowed labor forces to be fed. It supported urban life, because cities could not survive without a dependable staple that linked field to storehouse and storehouse to table. In ancient Egypt, bread reached an even more recognizable prominence. Egypt's agriculture depended on the Nile and its annual flood, which replenished the soil and supported massive grain production. Wheat and barley became foundations of the Egyptian diet, and bread was everywhere. It fed laborers, priests, scribes, and elites alike, though of course the quality differed sharply depending on status. Coarser breads with grit from stone milling were common among ordinary people. Finer, lighter, and more elaborate loaves belonged more often to wealthier tables and sacred settings. Egyptian tomb paintings, models, and excavated remains all point to a society deeply invested in baking. There were many shapes, many textures, and many methods. Bread was not incidental. It was one of the most visible products of an organized agrarian civilization. Egypt is also often placed near the center of one of bread's most important developments: leavening. Flatbreads are ancient and widespread, but a risen loaf required a different kind of understanding, even if it was first discovered by accident. At some point, probably through the natural fermentation of dough left to rest, people realized that a mixture of grain and water could become lighter, softer, and more complex in flavor if allowed time. This was a profound change. Leavened bread is not simply cooked dough. It is controlled transformation. It depends on invisible life, on yeasts and bacteria working through time. Someone, somewhere, had to notice that a dough forgotten or deliberately reserved behaved differently from a fresh one. Someone had to decide that this difference was desirable. and then a whole craft had to form around protecting, repeating, and refining that process. That discovery added a new layer to the meaning of bread. It was no longer only a product of land and labor. It became a product of timing, temperature, memory, and skill. A baker was not merely grinding and heating. A baker was managing change. That required attentiveness and experience. In this sense, bread became a record of accumulated knowledge. Recipes in the modern sense did not yet exist for most of history, but traditions did. Techniques moved through households, workshops, and generations. The success of bread depended on knowing how grain behaved, how finely to mill it, how wet to make the dough, how long to leave it, how hot the oven should be, and how to judge readiness without instruments. Bread may seem simple from a distance, but historically it has always sat at the meeting point of agriculture, chemistry, routine, and inherited craft. From Egypt and the Near East, bread culture continued to evolve across the Mediterranean world. The Greeks valued bread not only as daily nourishment but also as a marker of refinement. By the classical period, urban societies were developing more specialized food cultures, and bread diversified with them. Different grains, different textures, and different baking methods reflected both local conditions and social identity. The Greeks also contributed to the written description of food preparation in ways that help historians glimpse a world where bread could be discussed not only as necessity but also as quality. This is one of the key shifts in bread's history. Once a staple becomes secure enough, societies begin to notice its distinctions. They start to care not merely whether there is bread, but what kind of bread it is. The Romans took this process further and placed bread at the center of a vast imperial system. Rome was, among many other things, a machine for organizing food on a very large scale. Feeding the city of Rome was a political challenge of the highest order, and grain supply became tied to imperial stability. Bread for the urban population depended on fields far beyond the city itself, especially in places like Egypt and North Africa. Grain moved across the Mediterranean through networks of trade, taxation, and state power. Mills and bakeries expanded. Commercial baking became more common. Public concern over grain shortages and food prices could become political crisis. Bread, by this stage, was not just domestic sustenance. It was a matter of governance. Roman society also reveals how deeply bread could divide people even as it fed them all. The poor might eat dark, coarse loaves made from less desirable flour. The wealthy had access to finer white bread, which required more careful sifting and better grain. Social rank could be visible in the bread one ate. This is a recurring pattern throughout history, because grain quality, milling, and sieving require labor and resources. Lighter bread often became associated with status, while heavier bread remained the food of necessity. That distinction would survive for centuries. The loaf on the table could say something about class, access, and dignity without a single word being spoken. Yet bread also united people across those differences because nearly everyone depended on it. In the Roman world, as in many others, to speak of food security was often to speak of bread security. When supplies failed, anxiety spread quickly. When harvests were good, urban life felt steadier. This dependence explains why bread has so often appeared in religion, law, taxation, and public ritual. It was never just a side dish. It was the difference between order and unrest, health and weakness, confidence and fear. A society built on bread had to protect its grain, its roads, its mills, and its ovens. Entire systems stood behind a crust. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, bread did not disappear, but its forms and meanings continued to shift with local conditions across medieval Europe and beyond. In rural communities, bread remained bound to the agricultural calendar and to the realities of lordship, labor, and land access. People ate what their fields and rights allowed them to eat. Wheat bread was admired, but rye, barley, oats, and mixed grains were often more realistic for many regions and classes. Climate mattered. Soil mattered. Markets mattered. A poor harvest could thin loaves, change recipes, or force households to stretch flour with other ingredients. Medieval bread, then, is part of a broader story about subsistence, vulnerability, and adaptation. Even when bread was familiar, it was never guaranteed. Through the medieval centuries, bread remained the quiet foundation of everyday life across much of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Fields of grain determined the rhythm of the year. Planting, tending, harvesting, and storing were not abstract agricultural processes. They were matters of survival that shaped the calendar of entire communities. Once the harvest came in, the grain had to be protected carefully. Moisture could ruin it. Pests could destroy it. War could take it. If the grain failed, the bread failed, and when bread failed, everything else in society felt the shock. Most households in medieval villages did not bake bread every single day. Instead, many families prepared dough and then used communal ovens that were shared by the entire settlement. These ovens were often owned by a local lord or controlled by the village, and people brought their prepared loaves to be baked together in batches. The oven itself was an important social place. It required fuel, supervision, and organization. Villagers waited their turn, shared news, exchanged concerns about the harvest, and quietly observed each other's fortunes through the quality and size of the loaves they carried. The work behind those loaves was demanding. Before baking could even begin, grain had to be milled into flour. For centuries, this grinding work was done with heavy stones, often by hand, and it could take hours of steady effort to produce enough flour for a household. Later, watermills and windmills slowly transformed this labor. A flowing river or a strong breeze could turn millstones far more efficiently than human muscles alone. These mills became valuable pieces of rural infrastructure. They increased flour production, saved labor, and allowed communities to process larger harvests. But even with mills, bread remained tied to the uncertainties of nature. A wet year could spoil grain. A cold summer could shrink yields. A war could destroy fields before they were harvested. When shortages arrived, people stretched flour in creative ways. They might mix different grains together, add ground legumes, or in desperate moments incorporate ingredients like chestnuts or roots. The result was still called bread, but its taste and texture reflected the hardship behind it. In times of severe famine, bread itself could become dangerously scarce. Historical records across medieval Europe describe years when harvest failures caused widespread hunger. Prices rose quickly, and urban authorities worried that bread shortages might lead to unrest. Because bread was such a central food, its availability was closely watched by governments and city officials. Laws were created to regulate the weight and price of loaves. Bakers could be punished if they cheated customers or reduced the size of bread during times of high grain prices. These regulations tell us something important about bread's role in society. It was not treated as just another food item. It was considered essential to public stability. If bread became too expensive or too small, people noticed immediately. In many towns, inspectors visited bakeries to weigh loaves and ensure fairness. The goal was simple: to keep the daily bread supply predictable enough that ordinary people could continue living their lives without constant fear of sudden hunger. Meanwhile, bread was also becoming more diverse. Different regions developed distinct baking traditions shaped by their local grains and climates. In colder northern areas, rye bread became common because rye grew more reliably than wheat. These loaves were darker, denser, and often slightly sour from fermentation. In warmer regions with better wheat harvests, lighter breads appeared more frequently. Some breads were flat and thin, others tall and round, and some were baked so hard that they could be stored and transported for long periods. Even the ovens themselves shaped the final bread. A wood-fired oven heated with burning logs created a different crust and flavor than bread cooked on hot stones or griddles. Bakers learned to read the heat of their ovens carefully. Too hot and the crust burned before the inside cooked. Too cool and the loaf stayed heavy and underbaked. Like so many traditional crafts, baking relied on careful observation rather than written measurements. Bread also carried symbolic meaning during the medieval period. It appeared in religious ceremonies, charity, and social rituals. Offering bread to a guest was a sign of hospitality. Giving bread to the poor was an act of moral duty encouraged by religious teachings. In Christian traditions especially, bread became central to spiritual life through the Eucharist, where it symbolized sacred ideas of nourishment, sacrifice, and community. In this way, bread connected everyday survival with deeper cultural meanings. It fed bodies, but it also appeared in prayers, festivals, and traditions. A loaf placed on the table represented more than flour and water. It represented the labor of farmers, the turning of seasons, the work of millers and bakers, and the hope that another harvest would come. By the late medieval period and into the early modern era, cities were growing again across Europe. Urban populations needed reliable food supplies, and bread remained the most efficient way to feed large numbers of people. Bakeries expanded, and professional bakers became an established part of city economies. Guilds formed to regulate the baking trade, control training, and maintain quality standards. Inside these early bakeries, work began long before sunrise. Dough had to be prepared hours in advance, and ovens needed time to reach the right temperature. Bakers mixed flour, water, salt, and fermented starters into heavy dough that was kneaded repeatedly until it developed strength and elasticity. The dough rested, rose, and was shaped into loaves before entering the oven. Timing mattered at every step. For city residents waking in the morning, the smell of fresh bread drifting through narrow streets became a familiar part of daily life. Bakeries were small but essential businesses. Their doors opened early, serving workers, merchants, and families preparing for the day ahead. Bread was still the central staple of the diet. A person might eat it with soup, with cheese, with vegetables, or simply on its own. Despite its simplicity, bread had quietly traveled an extraordinary historical journey by this point. What began as crushed wild seeds cooked on hot stones had become a structured craft practiced in villages, cities, temples, and households across continents. The story of bread was no longer just about survival. It had become a story about community, labor, economy, and culture. And yet, even after thousands of years, the slow evolution of bread was far from finished. New technologies, new global trade networks, and new scientific discoveries were about to transform how bread was grown, milled, and baked, changes that would reshape one of humanity's oldest foods once again. As Europe moved deeper into the early modern period, the history of bread began to change in ways that were both subtle and far-reaching. For thousands of years, bread had been shaped mainly by agriculture, climate, and tradition. But now, expanding trade, growing cities, and new mechanical technologies began to influence how grain was produced and how bread was made. The loaf on the table still looked familiar, but behind it, the systems that supported it were becoming larger and more complex. One of the most important shifts involved milling. For centuries, flour had been produced by grinding grain between large stones. Stone milling worked well, but it also had limitations. The process could leave small fragments of bran and husk mixed into the flour, creating darker, heavier bread. While this bread was nutritious, many societies increasingly preferred lighter loaves made from finer flour. Producing that flour required careful sieving, which was labor-intensive and inefficient on a large scale. Gradually, improvements in milling technology began to appear. Watermills had already made grinding easier by using the energy of rivers to turn heavy stones. Windmills added another source of power in regions with strong and steady winds. These innovations increased flour production and reduced the physical labor required from individuals. Entire communities could now process grain faster and more reliably than before. At the same time, urban populations were continuing to grow. Cities such as London, Paris, and Amsterdam were expanding rapidly. Feeding these populations required more organized grain supply systems. Grain moved along rivers, across roads, and through maritime trade routes. Governments and merchants paid careful attention to the grain market because the price of bread could influence social stability. When grain was abundant, bread prices stayed low and life in the city felt manageable. But when harvests failed or trade routes were disrupted, prices could rise sharply, creating tension and anxiety among urban populations. Because bread was so central to daily survival, authorities often intervened directly in its production. In many cities, the weight and price of bread were regulated by law. Bakers were expected to produce loaves that matched official standards based on the current price of grain. Inspectors could visit bakeries and check the size of loaves to ensure fairness. This system aimed to protect ordinary people from exploitation while also preventing unrest caused by sudden food shortages. Despite these regulations, bread remained closely tied to social class. Wealthier households often preferred bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. These loaves were lighter in color and softer in texture. Achieving this quality required more processing and better grain, which made the bread more expensive. Meanwhile, many working families continued to eat darker breads made from whole grains, rye, or mixtures of grains depending on what was locally available. In Northern Europe especially, rye bread became deeply rooted in regional culture. Rye thrived in colder climates and poorer soils where wheat struggled to grow. The bread made from rye flour was dense and long-lasting, often slightly sour from fermentation. While it lacked the airy texture of wheat bread, it had an important advantage. It stayed fresh longer. In communities where food storage was critical through long winters, this durability mattered greatly. Another development during this period was the increasing professionalization of baking. Baking had long been practiced in homes and villages, but in growing cities it became a specialized trade. Bakers trained through apprenticeships, learning techniques that had been refined over generations. They mastered the timing of fermentation, the shaping of loaves, and the management of large wood-fired ovens. Inside a bakery, the work followed a demanding rhythm. Dough had to be prepared while the rest of the city slept. Bakers often began their work in the middle of the night, mixing flour, water, salt, and fermented starter into large batches of dough. Kneading strengthened the dough, helping it trap gases produced during fermentation. After resting, the dough was divided and shaped into loaves before being carefully placed into the oven. The oven itself was the heart of the bakery. Most traditional ovens were built from thick stone or brick that could absorb and hold heat. Wood was burned inside the chamber until the walls were hot enough for baking. The ashes were then cleared away, and the loaves were placed directly onto the heated surface. The retained heat slowly baked the bread, creating a crust while the inside remained soft. This process required experience and careful judgment. Bakers had no thermometers or digital timers. Instead, they relied on observation. The color of the oven walls, the smell of the wood, the feel of the dough, and the sound of the crust as it formed. Baking was a craft shaped by repetition and memory. Meanwhile, bread was also spreading across the world alongside expanding trade networks and colonial movements. European settlers carried wheat cultivation and baking traditions to new continents. Wheat fields appeared in parts of the Americas and later in Australia. Over time, these regions would become major producers of grain, feeding both local populations and distant markets. The global spread of wheat changed the geography of bread. Lands that had once been sparsely cultivated became vast agricultural regions. Grain harvests could now travel thousands of miles by ship before being milled and baked in distant cities. Bread was slowly becoming part of a worldwide food system rather than a purely local product. Even so, the basic ingredients of bread remained unchanged. Flour, water, salt, and fermentation still define the loaf. The methods had improved, and the scale had expanded, but the essential process still connected bakers to thousands of years of human experience. Yet the next chapter in the slow history of bread would bring changes unlike anything before it. New machines, new scientific discoveries, and the arrival of industrial production would reshape bread in ways that earlier bakers could hardly have imagined. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the world that had supported traditional bread making for thousands of years was beginning to transform. The Industrial Revolution did not only change factories, transportation, and cities. It also quietly reshaped how one of humanity's oldest foods was produced. Bread, which had long depended on local grain, small mills, and neighborhood bakeries, slowly entered a new era defined by machinery, scientific understanding, and large-scale production. One of the earliest and most influential changes happened in flour milling. For centuries, grain had been ground between heavy stone wheels. This process worked well enough, but it produced flour that still contained many parts of the grain kernel. While nutritious, this flour created darker and denser bread. During the 19th century, new milling technologies began to appear, especially the use of steel roller mills. Roller milling was a significant innovation. Instead of crushing grain between stones, roller mills passed wheat through a series of carefully spaced steel rollers. These rollers gradually separated the different parts of the grain, the bran, the germ, and the starchy endosperm. By isolating the endosperm, millers could produce a much finer and whiter flour than before. This new flour changed bread dramatically. It produced lighter loaves with softer textures and a pale interior that many consumers quickly came to prefer. In cities across Europe and North America, white bread became associated with modernity and refinement. To many people, it looked cleaner, softer, and more appealing than the darker breads that had been common for centuries. But the shift toward white flour also reflected deeper social changes. Industrial milling made it possible to produce enormous quantities of uniform flour. Instead of relying on small local mills, cities could now receive flour processed in large centralized facilities. Railways and steamships allowed grain to travel long distances quickly and reliably. Wheat harvested on distant farms could be milled in one region and baked into bread hundreds or even thousands of miles away. This expanding network connected farmers, millers, transport workers, merchants, and bakers in a growing global food system. Vast wheat fields appeared in places like the American Midwest, the Canadian prairies, and parts of Australia. These regions became major suppliers of grain to urban populations across the industrializing world. At the same time, the science of fermentation was beginning to be understood more clearly. For most of history, bakers had relied on natural sourdough starters, mixtures of flour and water containing wild yeasts and bacteria that caused dough to rise. These starters worked well but could behave unpredictably. Temperature, humidity, and microbial changes could all affect fermentation. During the 19th century, scientists studying microorganisms began to understand that yeast was a living organism responsible for fermentation. This discovery opened the door to more controlled baking processes. Commercial yeast production slowly developed, allowing bakers to use consistent strains of yeast rather than relying entirely on natural starters. With commercial yeast, dough could rise faster and more predictably. This made bread production easier to scale in busy urban bakeries. Bakers could produce more loaves in less time, meeting the growing demand of rapidly expanding city populations. Industrial bakeries soon appeared to take advantage of these changes. Large bakeries equipped with mechanical mixers, controlled ovens, and organized production lines could produce thousands of loaves each day. Workers handled different stages of the process: mixing dough, shaping loaves, loading ovens, and packaging finished bread. For many people living in industrial cities, bread was no longer something baked at home or purchased from a small neighborhood bakery. Instead, it arrived from large commercial operations designed to feed entire districts. The bread itself became increasingly standardized. Loaves were shaped uniformly, baked consistently, and sold in predictable sizes. This standardization had advantages. Bread became more affordable and widely available. Urban workers could rely on a steady supply of food even when they had little time to prepare meals themselves. Industrial bread production helped support the fast-paced life of modern cities. However, the new system also brought debates about quality and nutrition. Removing the bran and germ from wheat to produce white flour meant that some nutrients were lost in the process. While white bread looked appealing and tasted mild, it lacked certain vitamins and minerals found in whole grain bread. By the early 20th century, nutritionists and public health experts began to notice these differences. Discussions about the value of whole grains versus refined flour slowly entered public conversation. Some governments even introduced policies encouraging flour enrichment to restore lost nutrients. Meanwhile, bread continued to evolve with new technologies. Mechanical dough mixers reduced the physical labor required in bakeries. Conveyor ovens allowed continuous baking rather than batch production. Packaging innovations, including sliced and wrapped bread, made bread more convenient for consumers. In 1928, one small invention symbolized this changing relationship with bread: the automatic bread slicer. Sliced bread quickly became popular because it saved time and made sandwiches easier to prepare. Wrapped loaves stayed fresh longer and could be distributed through grocery stores rather than sold only in bakeries. The phrase "the best thing since sliced bread," which later became a common expression, reflected just how significant this small innovation felt at the time. Bread had been a familiar companion of human life for thousands of years. Yet even now it was still adapting to new technologies and lifestyles. Despite all these changes, the core identity of bread remained remarkably stable. Flour, water, salt, and yeast still formed the foundation. The tools had evolved, the scale had grown, and the networks behind the loaf had expanded across continents. But the fundamental idea remained the same: transforming simple grain into something nourishing, portable, and deeply human. And as the 20th century progressed, bread would once again face a new transformation, this time driven not only by industry, but also by changing tastes, cultural rediscovery, and a renewed interest in the ancient traditions that had shaped bread's long and quiet history. As the 20th century moved forward, bread entered another interesting chapter in its long story. For many people living in industrialized countries, bread had become something extremely familiar and dependable. It was sold in supermarkets, packaged neatly, sliced evenly, and produced in massive quantities. The loaf was now part of a modern food system designed for speed, convenience, and consistency. Yet beneath this surface of efficiency, new conversations were beginning to emerge about tradition, nutrition, and the deeper meaning of food. During the mid-20th century, industrial bread dominated the market in countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. Large commercial bakeries supplied most of the bread people ate. Their methods focused on efficiency. Dough could be mixed quickly by powerful machines. Fermentation could be shortened using commercial yeast and controlled conditions, and ovens could bake hundreds or thousands of loaves at once. One well-known example of this efficiency was the development of the Chorleywood bread process in Britain during the 1960s. This method used high-speed mixers and carefully measured ingredients to produce bread far more quickly than traditional fermentation allowed. In only a few hours, flour could be transformed into soft, uniform loaves ready for store shelves. For busy urban societies, this speed was extremely useful. Bread could be produced in huge volumes, helping keep prices low and supply steady. The result was bread that looked consistent wherever it was purchased. Loaves were soft, pale, and easy to slice. They fit neatly into toasters and lunch boxes. Sandwich bread became a central part of daily meals for millions of families. For school children, office workers, and factory laborers alike, sandwiches provided a simple and portable way to eat during the day. Yet even while industrial bread became widespread, some bakers and food thinkers began to wonder whether something important had been lost. Traditional bread making had always been slow. Dough once rested for many hours as natural fermentation developed flavor and texture. Stone-ground flour contained more of the grain's original nutrients. Regional breads carried the character of local grain varieties, water sources, and baking traditions. By the late 20th century, a growing movement of bakers and consumers started rediscovering these older practices. People became curious again about sourdough fermentation, long rising times, and whole grain flours. Artisan bakeries began appearing in cities that had once relied almost entirely on industrial bread. These bakeries often returned to methods that would have been familiar centuries earlier. Dough was mixed gently, allowed to ferment slowly, and shaped by hand. Bakers paid attention to the natural microorganisms in sourdough starters, sometimes maintaining the same culture for years or even decades. The result was bread with a more complex flavor, thicker crust, and varied texture. This revival was not simply about nostalgia. It reflected a broader shift in how people thought about food. After decades of industrial convenience, many consumers became interested in understanding where their food came from and how it was made. Bread, with its deep history and simple ingredients, became a perfect place to explore those questions. Farmers also began experimenting again with older grain varieties. Some traditional wheats had nearly disappeared during the push for industrial efficiency, which favored uniform crops that produced high yields. But heritage grains offered different flavors, textures, and nutritional profiles. Slowly, small agricultural networks formed to grow these varieties again. At the same time, scientific research continued to reveal more about fermentation and nutrition. Studies showed that long fermentation could make bread easier to digest for some people and could influence how nutrients were absorbed. Whole grains, once viewed by some as old-fashioned, regained attention for their health benefits. In many ways, this renewed interest brought bread's story full circle. After thousands of years of experimentation, industrial expansion, and technological change, people were once again fascinated by the simplest aspects of bread: flour, water, salt, and time. Today, bread exists in an extraordinary range of forms. Industrial bakeries still produce vast quantities of packaged loaves that feed large populations efficiently. Supermarkets carry sliced sandwich bread that fits modern lifestyles. At the same time, artisan bakeries produce handcrafted sourdough loaves, rye breads, and regional specialties inspired by centuries-old traditions. Across the world, bread also continues to reflect local cultures. In the Middle East and parts of North Africa, flatbreads remain central to meals. In Europe, dense rye loaves and crusty wheat breads share space on bakery shelves. In the Americas and Australia, both industrial sandwich bread and traditional styles coexist side by side. What makes bread remarkable is not only its variety, but its continuity. Despite enormous changes in technology, agriculture, and society, the essential idea has never disappeared. Human beings still take grain, grind it into flour, mix it with water, and apply heat to transform it into nourishment. This transformation links us to people who lived thousands of years ago. The early gatherers who crushed wild seeds on stone tools were solving the same basic problem that modern bakers solve today: how to turn a small, hard grain into something that can sustain life. The slow history of bread reminds us that some of the most important human achievements are not dramatic inventions but gradual improvements carried across generations. Bread was shaped by farmers learning which grains grew best in their soil. It was shaped by millers refining how grain could be ground. It was shaped by bakers patiently discovering how fermentation behaved in warm kitchens and cool cellars. Each generation added something small: a better oven, a more efficient mill, a new understanding of yeast, a new grain variety, a new method of shaping dough. None of these changes alone created bread as we know it, but together, over thousands of years, they formed one of the most enduring foods in human history. When a loaf of bread sits quietly on a kitchen table today, it rarely attracts much attention. It is simple, ordinary, and easy to overlook. Yet hidden inside that loaf is the story of agriculture, trade, science, culture, and survival. It is the story of how people learned to depend on the land without exhausting it. It is the story of communities organizing themselves around harvests and ovens. It is the story of how grain fields connected distant regions through trade routes and shipping lanes. And it is the story of how a food so simple could become a daily companion to billions of lives. Bread has traveled with humanity through the rise of ancient civilizations, the markets of medieval towns, the smoke of industrial bakeries, and the quiet revival of artisan workshops. It has fed emperors and laborers, priests and travelers, families and strangers. And perhaps that is why bread still carries such quiet significance. It is one of the few foods that has remained present through nearly every chapter of human history. Not because it is extravagant, but because it is reliable. Not because it is rare, but because it is shared. In the end, the history of bread is really the history of patience. Thousands of years of small discoveries slowly layered on top of one another. As we step back and look at the entire journey of bread, one thing becomes very clear. Its history is not a series of sudden revolutions, but a slow accumulation of small decisions made by countless ordinary people. Farmers choosing which grains to plant. Families grinding flour in the quiet rhythm of daily life. Bakers adjusting their dough by instinct, guided only by touch, smell, and experience. Over thousands of years, these small acts formed one of the most stable and enduring food traditions in human history. Bread followed human settlement almost everywhere agriculture took root. In regions where wheat thrived, soft loaves and flatbreads became staples. In colder or wetter climates, rye and barley shaped darker breads that were dense but reliable. In some places bread was thin and cooked quickly over hot surfaces. In others it rose slowly in warm kitchens before entering deep ovens built from clay or stone. Each environment produced its own version of bread, but the core process remained remarkably familiar. What is fascinating is how bread managed to stay both universal and local at the same time. Nearly every agricultural society developed some form of bread, yet each culture gave it its own character. Ingredients changed, techniques changed, ovens changed. Even the shape of bread could carry meaning. Long loaves, round loaves, braided loaves, flat rounds, thick blocks of rye, delicate layered breads. Each one reflected the environment and the habits of the people who made it. For many centuries, bread was not simply a food but a measure of stability. When grain harvests were good, bread was plentiful, and societies could focus on other pursuits: trade, art, governance, or exploration. When harvests failed, the absence of bread could quickly lead to crisis. Food shortages often began with the disappearance of bread from markets and tables. Because bread was so central to the daily diet, even small disruptions could ripple outward through an entire society. This deep dependence explains why grain and bread appear repeatedly in historical records. Governments tracked harvests carefully. Cities built granaries to store surplus grain in case of poor seasons. Trade networks developed specifically to transport grain between regions. The movement of wheat and other cereals across seas and rivers often shaped the fortunes of entire empires. One famous example is the ancient Roman grain supply. The city of Rome depended heavily on grain shipments from provinces like Egypt and North Africa. Without those shipments, the population of the capital could not have been sustained. Bread, in this sense, was not just nourishment. It was part of the infrastructure of empire. Roads, ships, ports, and storehouses all existed partly to ensure that grain could be turned into bread for millions of people. Centuries later, the same principle would guide early modern states as cities expanded across Europe. Governments knew that keeping bread affordable and available was essential to maintaining order. Bakeries were regulated. Grain reserves were monitored. The price of bread could even become a political issue, influencing public trust in rulers and institutions. But bread's story is not only about politics or economics. It is also about the quiet intimacy of daily life. For most of history, bread was made in kitchens and small bakeries by people who knew the craft through practice rather than formal instruction. Recipes were rarely written down. Instead, techniques passed from parent to child, from master baker to apprentice, from neighbor to neighbor. In those kitchens, the process unfolded slowly. Flour was poured into bowls or wooden troughs. Water was added gradually. Salt was mixed in. Then came the patient work of kneading, pressing and folding the dough until it developed the structure needed to rise properly. Hands learned to recognize the right texture, the right elasticity, the right weight. Once kneaded, the dough rested. During this time, the invisible work of fermentation began. Yeasts and bacteria consumed sugars within the dough, releasing gases that slowly expanded the mixture. The dough grew lighter, softer, and more complex in flavor. In a quiet room, covered with cloth. A simple mixture of flour and water transformed itself. When the dough had risen enough, it was shaped and placed into an oven. Traditional ovens were heated long before baking began. Wood fires warmed the thick stone walls until they stored enough heat to cook the bread evenly. The fire was swept aside, and the loaves were placed directly onto the hot surface. As the bread baked, the outside formed a crust while the inside remained moist and airy. The smell of bread baking has long been one of the most familiar signals of home and community. Throughout history, that aroma drifting through streets or villages often meant that the day's food was nearly ready. It was a quiet reassurance that, at least for that moment, the household would be fed. In modern times, bread remains deeply embedded in everyday routines. In many households across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, bread appears in breakfasts, lunches, and evening meals. Toast in the morning, sandwiches during the day, bread served alongside soup or salad. These habits may seem simple, but they echo thousands of years of food traditions. Even when diets diversify and new foods appear, bread often remains present because it adapts so easily. It can be thin or thick, soft or crisp, sweet or savory, can accompany nearly any other ingredient. A single loaf can be sliced, toasted, dipped, filled, or layered. What makes bread especially remarkable is that its fundamental ingredients are so minimal. Flour, water, salt, and yeast are enough to produce something deeply satisfying. This simplicity allowed bread to travel through history with humanity wherever grain agriculture existed. It required few ingredients but rewarded patience and skill. Today, we live in a time when bread can be produced faster and in greater quantities than ever before. Modern agriculture grows enormous wheat harvests. Industrial mills process grain at astonishing speeds. Large bakeries supply cities with thousands of loaves each day. Supermarkets stock shelves with bread in dozens of varieties. At the same time, many people are rediscovering older approaches. Artisan bakeries experiment with long fermentation, heritage grains, and traditional techniques. Home bakers mix dough in their kitchens, sometimes maintaining sourdough starters that live for years. These practices connect modern life with traditions that stretch back centuries. In this way, the story of bread continues to evolve. Technology and tradition now exist side by side. A person might buy packaged sandwich bread from a grocery store one day and a hand-shaped sourdough loaf from a small bakery the next. Both forms belong to the same long history, and that history reminds us of something quietly profound. Bread is not the product of a single invention or a single culture. It is the outcome of thousands of years of shared human effort. No single person created bread as we know it. Instead, it emerged gradually from countless experiments carried out by farmers, millers, bakers, and families across generations. Every loaf carries traces of that history. The grain reflects the fields where it was grown. The flour reflects the methods used to mill it. The fermentation reflects the living organisms that transform the dough. The final bread reflects the hands that shaped it and the heat that baked it. When we look at bread this way, it becomes more than just food. It becomes a quiet record of how human societies learned to cooperate with nature, with each other, and with time itself. From the first crushed seeds gathered by early humans to the carefully baked loaves in modern kitchens, bread has remained a companion to human survival and creativity. The slow history of bread is, in many ways, the slow history of civilization itself. It is the story of how people turned fragile grains into reliable nourishment, how they built communities around shared labor and shared meals, and how something so simple could endure through thousands of years of change. And perhaps that is why bread still feels meaningful today. Even in a fast-moving modern world, a loaf of bread reminds us of patience, of craft, and of continuity. It reminds us that some of the most important things in human life are built slowly, one careful step at a time. As we reach the later chapters of bread's long story, it becomes clear that bread has never been a finished invention. Even after thousands of years of development, people continue to change how bread is grown, milled, baked, and understood. Each generation inherits the accumulated knowledge of the past, but it also reshapes that knowledge according to new technologies, new tastes, and new ways of living. One of the most noticeable changes in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been the renewed attention given to the origins of food. For much of the industrial era, food systems grew larger and more distant from the people who consumed them. Grain was harvested by large machines, transported across continents, processed in vast mills, and baked in factories capable of producing tens of thousands of loaves each day. For efficiency and affordability, these systems worked extremely well. Bread became inexpensive, widely available, and remarkably consistent. Yet as these systems matured, many consumers began asking new questions. Where does the wheat come from? How is the flour produced? What happens during fermentation? These questions sparked a growing interest in traditional baking techniques that had once been common but had gradually faded during the age of industrial efficiency. Across cities in North America, Europe, and Australia, small bakeries began experimenting again with long fermentation methods. Instead of rushing dough through rapid mechanical processes, bakers allowed it to rise slowly over many hours. This slow fermentation allowed natural microorganisms to develop deeper flavors and complex textures within the bread. The crust became thicker, the crumb more irregular, and the taste more layered. For many bakers, this return to slower methods was not simply about flavor. It was about reconnecting with the craft itself. Traditional baking required careful attention. Temperature, humidity, and timing all influenced the final loaf. Bakers observed the dough closely, adjusting their process based on experience rather than strict formulas. In doing so, they rediscovered a relationship with bread that earlier generations had taken for granted. At the same time, farmers and agricultural researchers began exploring older varieties of grain that had nearly disappeared during the 20th century. Modern agriculture had focused heavily on wheat varieties that produced high yields and uniform harvests, which made large-scale milling easier. But many historical grains possessed distinct flavors and nutritional characteristics that had been overlooked during the push for efficiency. Heritage wheats, ancient grains, and regionally adapted varieties slowly returned to cultivation in certain areas. Farmers experimented with growing grains that had been common centuries earlier. These grains sometimes required different farming methods and produced smaller harvests, but they offered diversity and resilience within agricultural systems. This renewed interest in grain diversity also reflected growing awareness of how food systems interact with the environment. Large monoculture fields, while efficient, can sometimes make ecosystems more vulnerable to pests, disease, and climate fluctuations. By reintroducing a wider range of grain varieties, farmers could help restore a measure of agricultural balance that had existed in earlier eras. Bread once again became a meeting point between agriculture, science, and tradition. Meanwhile, technology continued to shape bread production in new ways. Modern bakeries now use precise temperature controls, automated mixers, and carefully monitored fermentation environments to achieve consistent results. Even artisan bakeries often combine traditional techniques with modern tools that help maintain quality and efficiency. Large industrial bakeries have also improved their processes over time. Many now incorporate enriched flours, controlled fermentation systems, and advanced packaging methods that extend freshness without sacrificing safety. Bread can be transported across long distances while still reaching consumers in good condition. Packaging itself has become a significant part of modern bread's journey. For centuries, bread was sold fresh and eaten quickly. Today, sealed packaging helps preserve moisture and protect bread from contamination. Sliced bread remains especially popular because it offers convenience for everyday meals. Families preparing breakfast or packing lunches often rely on this consistency. Despite these modern changes, bread remains deeply tied to cultural identity. Around the world, people continue to prepare breads that reflect centuries of regional tradition. In parts of Europe, crusty wheat loaves remain a daily staple. In the Middle East and Central Asia, flatbreads baked in hot clay ovens still accompany nearly every meal. In Northern and Eastern Europe, dense rye breads remain part of local heritage. Even within a single country, bread can vary widely from one region to another. The grains available, the climate, and the history of migration all influence the breads that people bake and eat. Recipes travel with families and communities, sometimes crossing oceans as people settle in new lands. In countries shaped by immigration, such as the United States, Canada, and Australia, bread traditions from many cultures often exist side by side. Bakeries may sell French-style baguettes, Middle Eastern flatbreads, European rye loaves, and modern sandwich bread all within the same neighborhood. This diversity reflects the way bread adapts to human movement and cultural exchange. Bread's ability to travel and transform may be one reason it has survived so many centuries of change. It is flexible enough to absorb new techniques while still retaining its essential identity. The same four ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast continue to support an astonishing range of outcomes depending on how they are combined. For historians, bread offers a unique lens through which to understand human civilization. Few foods appear so consistently across time and geography. Its presence in archaeological remains, written records, art, and daily life makes it one of the clearest markers of how societies organize themselves around agriculture and sustenance. Grain fields represent long-term investment in land. Mills represent technological innovation. Bakeries represent skilled labor and community service. Bread connects all these elements together into a food that is both ordinary and essential. When we follow bread through history, we also follow the development of trade networks, transportation systems, and urban growth. Grain moved along ancient caravan routes, across Mediterranean shipping lanes, and later through railways and steamships that linked continents. Each stage of transportation allowed grain to travel farther and feed larger populations. This expansion helped cities grow. A stable supply of grain meant that fewer people needed to remain on farms producing food. More people could specialize in other crafts, professions, and industries. In this way, bread quietly supported the rise of complex societies. Yet bread has always remained grounded in something simple: the transformation of grain into nourishment. Even today, when someone mixes flour and water in a kitchen, they are repeating a process that reaches back thousands of years. The gestures are ancient. The waiting for dough to rise is familiar to countless generations who performed the same task long before written recipes existed. Perhaps that is why bread carries such emotional resonance in many cultures. It is associated with comfort, home, and shared meals. Breaking bread together has long symbolized trust, hospitality, and cooperation. Across languages and traditions, the act of sharing bread often represents the idea of community itself. In the end, the slow history of bread reveals something fundamental about human progress. Civilization is not built only through dramatic inventions or sudden breakthroughs. Much of it grows quietly through repeated actions performed day after day by ordinary people. A farmer planting grain in autumn, a miller grinding wheat into flour, a baker kneading dough before dawn, a family gathering around a table. These small acts, repeated across centuries, created one of the most enduring foods in human history. Bread has witnessed the rise of cities, the expansion of empires, the arrival of industry, and the rediscovery of ancient traditions. And through all of those changes, the loaf itself has remained surprisingly familiar. The crust still cracks when it cools. The interior still holds warmth and softness. The smell of fresh bread still signals nourishment and care. In a world that changes quickly, bread reminds us that some human traditions move slowly, and that their strength often lies in that patience. The next time a loaf sits quietly on a kitchen table, it may look simple. But behind that simplicity lies thousands of years of observation, effort, and shared human knowledge. It is a story written not in books alone, but in fields of grain, in the turning of millstones, and in the quiet warmth of ovens that have burned across the long arc of human history. Even after tracing thousands of years of bread's development, there is still another quiet dimension to its history: the way bread shapes daily human rhythm. Bread has always existed at the intersection of time, patience, and routine. Unlike many foods that can be prepared quickly, bread demands a slower pace. Grain must grow across seasons. Flour must be milled. Dough must rest and ferment. Baking must happen at the right moment. Because of this, bread has always encouraged people to think in terms of cycles rather than speed. For farmers, the story of bread begins months before a loaf ever appears. Wheat fields must be planted at the correct time, often in autumn or spring depending on the region. Through winter or early summer, the grain grows slowly. Rainfall, sunlight, and soil conditions all influence the harvest. When the grain finally ripens, it must be gathered quickly and carefully before weather or pests damage the crop. In earlier centuries, entire communities often participated in harvest work, cutting stalks by hand and bundling them together to dry. Once harvested, the grain must be separated from its husks through threshing and winnowing. For thousands of years, this work was done manually using flails or simple tools to break the grain free. The grain was then tossed into the air so the wind could carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier seeds fell back to the ground. Only after this careful preparation could the grain be stored safely. Storage itself was a critical stage in the bread cycle. Grain had to remain dry and protected from insects or rodents. Ancient societies built granaries, clay storage vessels, and underground pits specifically to protect their harvest. If grain spoiled during storage, an entire year's food supply could vanish. Bread, therefore, was tied not only to farming but also to careful management of resources. When grain finally reached the mill, another stage of transformation began. Milling has always been one of the most labor-intensive parts of bread production. Early hand stones required constant effort to grind even a small amount of flour. The invention of watermills and windmills changed this dramatically. These mills allowed communities to harness natural energy, freeing people from hours of grinding by hand. Inside a traditional mill, large stones rotated against one another, gradually crushing grain into flour. The miller had to monitor the process carefully. If the stones turned too quickly, the flour could become overheated and damaged. If they turned too slowly, the grinding would be inefficient. Adjusting the stones required skill and experience. Flour emerging from the mill was often sifted to remove larger particles of bran. The degree of sifting varied depending on the desired type of bread. Coarse flour produced darker loaves rich in fiber and nutrients. Finely sifted flour produced lighter, softer bread that many societies associated with higher social status. When flour finally reached the baker, the familiar process of dough making could begin. Yet even this step contained many subtle variations developed across centuries. The proportion of water in dough, known today as hydration, influenced how soft or firm the bread would become. Higher hydration produced open, airy textures, while lower hydration produced firmer loaves. Kneading was essential because it developed gluten, the protein network within wheat that allows dough to stretch and trap gases. Without kneading, dough would remain dense and flat. Bakers learned to fold and stretch the dough repeatedly until it reached the proper strength. Then came fermentation, the stage that gives bread much of its flavor and texture. In sourdough traditions, natural yeasts and bacteria from the surrounding environment live within the dough. These microorganisms feed on sugars in the flour and release carbon dioxide, slowly expanding the dough. At the same time, they produce acids that give sourdough its characteristic taste. Fermentation can take many hours and sometimes even days. Temperature strongly affects the process. In warm kitchens, dough may rise quickly. In cooler conditions, fermentation slows and flavors deepen. Bakers throughout history learned to adapt their methods depending on the weather, the season, and the environment of their bakery. Once fermentation has progressed enough, the dough is shaped into loaves. Shaping is more than cosmetic. It organizes the internal structure of the dough, helping it hold its shape during baking. Some breads are shaped into long forms, others into round loaves, and some into braided or decorative designs used during festivals or celebrations. The oven represents the final transformation in bread's journey. Traditional wood-fired ovens operate through retained heat. The oven is heated with burning wood until its walls and floor absorb enough energy to bake the bread. Once the fire is removed, the stored heat gradually cooks the loaves placed inside. During baking, several important chemical reactions occur. The heat causes gases within the dough to expand rapidly, creating what bakers call oven spring. At the same time, the crust forms through complex browning reactions between sugars and proteins. This process, known today as the Maillard reaction, produces the rich aroma and golden color that many people associate with freshly baked bread. As the loaf cools, its structure stabilizes. Moisture redistributes inside the crumb, and the crust firms slightly. Only after cooling does bread reach its final texture and flavor. Cutting into bread too early can release steam and compress the interior, which is why bakers often wait before slicing. These details may sound technical, but they reflect thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. Early bakers did not use scientific terms, yet through observation and repetition they learned how dough behaved. Their understanding was practical and sensory. They relied on the feel of the dough beneath their hands, the smell of fermentation, and the sound of bread tapping hollow when fully baked. This deep familiarity with bread making once existed in many households. In earlier centuries, baking bread at home was a regular task in rural life. Families maintained their own sourdough starters and baked loaves weekly or even daily. Children grew up watching the process and gradually learning it themselves. Industrialization changed this relationship. As commercial bakeries expanded, many households stopped baking their own bread. Instead, they purchased loaves prepared by professional bakers or large factories. This shift allowed people to save time, but it also distanced many consumers from the process behind their food. In recent decades, however, interest in home baking has returned in many parts of the world. People have rediscovered the satisfaction of mixing dough, watching it rise, and baking it in their own kitchens. For some, the process offers a connection to older traditions. For others, it provides a slower activity within fast-paced modern life. Bread also continues to appear in moments of celebration and ceremony. Many cultures prepare special breads during holidays or religious events. These breads may be shaped into symbolic forms, enriched with eggs or butter, or decorated in ways that reflect local traditions. Even today, bread often carries meaning beyond nutrition. When people gather for meals, bread is frequently placed at the center of the table. It can be torn, sliced, dipped, or shared. This act of sharing bread has long symbolized cooperation and community. Across many cultures, offering bread to a guest represents hospitality and welcome. In a broader sense, bread represents the human ability to transform nature into sustenance through knowledge and patience. Grain alone is not immediately satisfying. It requires grinding, mixing, fermentation, and heat. Each step represents an understanding of how natural materials behave. Over thousands of years, people refined this understanding little by little. No single generation invented bread in its final form. Instead, countless small improvements accumulated across time. Farmers improved crops. Millers refined flour. Bakers experimented with fermentation and baking techniques. The result is a food that appears simple but carries deep historical complexity. Bread connects agriculture, chemistry, economics, culture, and daily life in a single object. When we consider the slow history of bread, we see more than the evolution of a food. We see the gradual development of human civilization itself. Bread supported early villages, sustained ancient cities, traveled along trade routes, and adapted to industrial technology. It survived wars, migrations, and environmental changes. And even now, in the modern world, bread continues to evolve. New grains are explored. Bakers experiment with fermentation methods. Scientists study nutrition and microbial cultures. At the same time, ancient techniques remain alive in bakeries and kitchens around the world. This balance between innovation and tradition may be the true strength of bread. It is flexible enough to change, yet stable enough to remain recognizable across centuries. A loaf of bread sitting quietly on a table today might appear ordinary. But if we look closely, We can see within it the memory of fields, mills, ovens, and hands that shaped dough long before our time. It carries within its crust and crumb the quiet legacy of human patience. And that legacy continues each time flour meets water, each time dough rises slowly in a bowl, and each time a warm loaf is broken and shared. As the story of bread continues into the present day, something interesting begins to happen. For thousands of years, bread was mainly a necessity. It existed because people needed reliable calories that could be stored, transported, and shared. But in the modern world, bread has also become a subject of curiosity, craftsmanship, and even quiet reflection about how humans interact with food itself. Part of this shift comes from the way modern life has accelerated. Industrial societies move quickly. Meals are often short. Food can be prepared, packaged, and consumed in minutes. In that environment, bread holds an unusual place. Even when produced by machines, its origins remain rooted in slow biological processes. Fermentation still takes time. Grain still requires months to grow. Flour still begins as something harvested from the soil. Because of that, bread often reminds people of an older rhythm of life. Many artisan bakers speak about fermentation not only as a chemical process, but as a way of working with time. A dough that ferments overnight behaves differently than one rushed through a factory mixer. The microorganisms inside the dough slowly reshape its structure, producing flavors that cannot be rushed. In this way, bread becomes a collaboration between human intention and natural processes. Across many cities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, small bakeries have embraced this slower perspective. These bakeries often begin their work late at night or very early in the morning. Flour is weighed carefully. Water temperature is adjusted depending on the weather. Dough rests in wooden or metal containers, sometimes for many hours. Inside these bakeries, the atmosphere can feel very different from a factory environment. The pace is deliberate. Bakers check the dough periodically, folding it gently to strengthen its structure. When the dough has fermented enough, it is divided and shaped into loaves. Each loaf is slightly different, reflecting the living nature of the dough. Ovens are often heated long before the first loaf enters. Modern artisan ovens may use gas or electricity, but they still aim to recreate the intense radiant heat of traditional wood-fired ovens. When bread enters the oven, steam is sometimes injected to help create a crisp crust. The loaf expands rapidly during the first minutes of baking, a stage bakers call oven spring. As the bread finishes baking, the crust darkens into shades of golden brown. The smell that fills the bakery is unmistakable. It is a scent that people across cultures recognize immediately. For thousands of years, the aroma of bread baking has signaled that food is nearly ready, that nourishment is close at hand. Once removed from the oven, loaves must cool before they are sliced or sold. During cooling, the structure of the bread stabilizes. Moisture redistributes inside the crumb. the crust becomes slightly firmer. Many bakers still listen for a particular sound during this stage: the faint crackling of the crust as it cools. This quiet sound, sometimes called the song of the bread, marks the final stage of the baking process. While artisan baking has grown in popularity, industrial bread production continues to play a vital role in feeding large populations. Modern commercial bakeries operate with extraordinary efficiency. Conveyor systems move dough through mixing, shaping, proofing, and baking stages with precise timing. Sensors monitor temperature and humidity to ensure consistent results. These bakeries can produce thousands of identical loaves each hour. For supermarkets and food distribution systems, this consistency is essential. Families depend on affordable bread that remains fresh for several days. Industrial processes allow bread to be packaged quickly and transported across wide regions. In many ways, the modern bread landscape reflects a balance between these two approaches. Industrial production provides scale and accessibility, ensuring that bread remains widely available. Artisan baking preserves diversity and tradition, reminding people of the deeper craft behind the food at the same time. The grains themselves are becoming a subject of renewed interest. Agricultural scientists and farmers are studying how different wheat varieties influence flavor, texture, and nutritional value. Some bakers now work directly with farmers to select specific grain types suited to their bread. These partnerships resemble older agricultural relationships that existed long before global commodity markets dominated grain trade. Instead of anonymous wheat shipped from distant regions, some bakeries now highlight the farms where their grain was grown. This transparency allows consumers to understand the journey from field to loaf. Another fascinating development involves sourdough cultures themselves. A sourdough starter is a living community of microorganisms maintained by feeding it flour and water regularly. Some starters have been kept alive for decades, even generations. Bakers sometimes name their starters, treating them almost like living companions within the bakery. Scientists studying these cultures have discovered that different environments produce distinct microbial communities. A sourdough starter maintained in San Francisco may contain different strains of yeast and bacteria than one kept in London or Melbourne. These differences subtly influence flavor and fermentation behavior. In this way, bread reflects not only human culture but also local ecosystems. The microorganisms present in flour, air, and water all contribute to the character of a loaf. Bread becomes a quiet expression of place. Despite all this complexity, bread's fundamental simplicity continues to inspire people. With only a few ingredients, a baker can produce something deeply nourishing. Flour provides carbohydrates and structure. Water activates the proteins in wheat. Salt strengthens flavor and regulates fermentation. Yeast or natural cultures create the gases that lift the dough. From these basic components emerges a food that can take countless forms. Some breads are thin and crisp, others soft and airy. Some are dark with whole grains, others pale and delicate. Some are eaten fresh from the oven, others toasted or dried for later use. This versatility explains why bread has traveled so easily across cultures and centuries. It adapts to whatever grains are available, whatever ovens exist, and whatever flavors people prefer. Even societies without wheat have developed bread-like foods from other grains such as maize, rice, or millet. Bread also carries strong symbolic meaning in many traditions. Religious rituals, harvest celebrations, and family gatherings often include special breads prepared only during certain times of the year. These breads may be braided, sweetened, or decorated with intricate patterns. Their preparation becomes a shared cultural activity. In many households, bread remains part of everyday comfort. Toast in the morning, a sandwich at midday, bread served with dinner. These habits feel ordinary, yet they echo centuries of human routine. Each time bread is eaten, it continues a chain of experience stretching far into the past. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of bread's history is its continuity. Human societies have changed dramatically over thousands of years. Technologies have advanced. Cities have risen and fallen. Trade networks have expanded across oceans. Yet bread has remained present through all of these transformations. It has fed ancient farmers, medieval villagers, industrial workers, and modern families. It has appeared in clay ovens, stone hearths, steel factories, and home kitchens. Few foods have accompanied humanity for so long or adapted so successfully to changing circumstances. When historians describe the slow history of bread, they are describing this steady accumulation of knowledge across generations. No single invention created bread as we know it today. Instead, thousands of small improvements gradually shaped it. Someone learned that grinding grain made it easier to digest. Someone discovered that mixing flour with water created dough. Someone noticed that dough left to rest would rise and become lighter. Someone built a better oven. Someone refined the milling process. Someone improved the cultivation of wheat. Each discovery added another layer to the tradition. Over centuries, these layers formed a system so reliable that bread became one of the most common foods on earth. Today, when a loaf of bread sits on a kitchen counter, it may seem simple and unremarkable. But within that loaf lies a history that spans agriculture, science, culture, and human cooperation. It represents the quiet work of countless people who shaped grain into nourishment long before the modern world existed. And that long story continues each time flour meets water, each time dough is kneaded by hand or machine, and each time a loaf emerges warm from the oven. Bread, in the end, is more than food. It is a reminder that some of humanity's greatest achievements are built slowly, through patience, observation, and the steady passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. As we move toward the closing reflections of bread's long journey, it is worth considering why this particular food endured while so many others disappeared or changed beyond recognition. Human diets have evolved constantly. New crops have been discovered, new cooking techniques invented, and entire cuisines have emerged and faded across centuries. Yet bread, despite endless variations, remains one of the most recognizable foods on Earth. Part of the answer lies in the nature of grain itself. Cereals such as wheat, barley, and rye have several qualities that made them uniquely suited to support civilization. They grow in large quantities, they can be dried and stored for long periods, and they contain dense energy that sustains human labor. Once early societies discovered how to cultivate these grains, they possessed something extremely valuable: a crop that could feed entire populations year after year. But grain alone is not immediately satisfying food. Raw kernels are hard, dry, and difficult to digest. The transformation of grain into flour and flour into bread was therefore one of humanity's earliest acts of food technology. It required observation and patience. People had to discover grinding, mixing, fermentation, and baking long before they understood the science behind these processes. Once those discoveries were made, however, bread offered something extraordinary: reliability. A sack of grain could be stored through winter. Flour could be turned into dough when needed. Bread could be baked daily or in batches that lasted several days. For communities living with uncertain harvests and changing seasons, this reliability meant survival. That reliability also helped societies grow more complex. When food supplies became stable enough, fewer people needed to spend all their time searching for nourishment. Some individuals could specialize as builders, traders, scribes, teachers, or craftsmen. Cities could expand because grain could be transported and stored in large quantities. In this way, bread was not simply a food that followed civilization. It helped make civilization possible. Archaeologists often notice that the rise of large settlements corresponds closely with the development of grain agriculture and milling technology. Where mills appeared, flour production increased. Where flour increased, bread became a dependable staple. And where bread became dependable, populations could grow. Over time, bread also became embedded in language itself. Many cultures developed phrases that connect bread with livelihood and survival. Expressions like earning one's bread or breadwinner reflect how deeply this food became linked to daily work and family stability. In earlier centuries, to lose access to bread meant facing immediate hardship. Religious traditions also recognized the symbolic importance of bread. In many spiritual practices, bread represents life, nourishment, and community. Rituals involving bread appear in ancient temples, medieval churches, and modern ceremonies. The act of breaking bread together often symbolizes unity or reconciliation. This symbolism likely developed because bread was already central to daily existence. People saw it every day. They depended on it every day. When something appears so consistently at the center of life, it naturally gains deeper meaning. Another remarkable aspect of bread's history is its adaptability. Even when wheat was unavailable, societies found ways to create bread-like foods from other grains or seeds. Cornbread in the Americas, rice-based flatbreads in parts of Asia, and millet breads in certain African regions all demonstrate how the concept of bread can evolve depending on local resources. The basic idea remains the same. Grind a grain, mix it with water, and apply heat. Yet the results can differ dramatically depending on ingredients and techniques. Some breads are crisp and thin. Others are thick and soft. Some are fermented for many hours, while others are cooked almost immediately. Because of this flexibility, bread traveled easily alongside human migration. When people moved to new lands, they brought their baking traditions with them. Sometimes they continued using familiar grains if the climate allowed. Other times they adapted their methods to new crops available in their environment. Throughout history, migration has constantly reshaped bread traditions. A bakery in a modern city might sell French baguettes, Middle Eastern flatbreads, German rye loaves, and American sandwich bread all within the same neighborhood. Each style reflects the journey of people who carried their baking knowledge across continents. This exchange of techniques continues today. Bakers around the world experiment with combining traditions, creating breads that blend ingredients or methods from different cultures. In doing so, they extend bread's long history of adaptation. Modern science has also deepened our understanding of what happens during bread making. Researchers now study fermentation at the microscopic level, examining how different yeast strains influence flavor and texture. Nutritionists analyze the effects of whole grains, fiber, and fermentation on human health. Agricultural scientists continue developing wheat varieties suited to changing climates. These scientific insights help improve bread production, but they also highlight how much earlier generations accomplished without modern tools. Ancient bakers did not know about microorganisms or gluten proteins, yet they developed techniques that worked remarkably well. Their knowledge came through observation. They noticed that dough rose when left to rest. They noticed that certain starters produced better bread than others. They noticed that ovens required particular temperatures and timing. Over centuries, these observations formed a practical science passed through tradition. Today's bakers still rely partly on that sensory knowledge. Even with precise scales and temperature controls, experienced bakers often trust their eyes and hands. They look for the smooth surface of properly kneaded dough. They feel the elasticity that indicates good gluten development. They listen for the hollow sound when a loaf is tapped after baking. This connection between past and present is one reason bread continues to fascinate people. When someone bakes bread today, they participate in a process that links them with generations of bakers before them. The gestures, mixing, kneading, shaping, are ancient. Perhaps that continuity explains why bread often feels comforting. It carries with it the memory of shared meals, family kitchens, and community gatherings. The smell of bread baking has triggered feelings of warmth and anticipation for countless generations. Even in a world filled with advanced technology and complex cuisine, bread remains quietly familiar. It appears on restaurant tables, in lunch boxes, at breakfast counters, and beside bowls of soup. It may be toasted, sliced, dipped, or simply torn apart and shared. And each loaf still begins with the same humble transformation. Grain ground into flour, flour mixed with water, dough lifted by fermentation, and heat applied to create something nourishing. The slow history of bread reminds us that human progress is often built through patience rather than speed. Agriculture developed over centuries. Milling improved gradually. Baking techniques refined themselves through repetition and shared knowledge. Each improvement was small, but together they produced a food that sustained entire civilizations. When we look at bread today, we see the final result of this long collaboration between nature and human ingenuity. Fields of wheat capture sunlight and turn it into grain. Mills transform grain into flour. Bakers shape flour into dough and guide it through fermentation and heat. The finished loaf may look simple, but it carries within it a long chain of human effort stretching back thousands of years. And so the next time bread appears quietly on a table, it may be worth pausing for a moment. Behind that loaf lies the story of farmers working in fields, millstones turning slowly, ovens warming in early morning darkness, and generations of people who refine this craft step by step. Bread may be ordinary, but its history is anything but. It is one of the clearest reminders that the foundations of civilization are often built not from dramatic inventions, but from patient traditions repeated day after day across the long arc of human time. And in that sense, the slow history of bread is really the slow history of us. As we bring this long story to its close, it becomes easier to see why bread has remained such a constant companion throughout human history. Few foods have traveled alongside humanity for so many thousands of years. From the first crushed wild grains gathered by early communities to the carefully baked loaves found in modern kitchens and bakeries, bread has quietly followed the development of civilization itself. What makes bread remarkable is not just its age, but the way it reflects human cooperation with nature. Grain must grow slowly in the soil, shaped by sunlight, rain, and the patience of farmers. Milling transforms those grains into flour through tools that humans refined over generations. Bakers then guide flour through fermentation and heat, turning something simple into nourishment. Every loaf is therefore the result of a long chain of work. Farmers plant and harvest. Millers grind grain into flour. Bakers mix, knead, and bake. Even the microorganisms involved in fermentation play their part, quietly shaping flavor and texture. Bread is one of the clearest examples of how human knowledge and natural processes come together. Over time, societies built entire systems around this food. Fields were cultivated to grow grain reliably. Mills were constructed along rivers and windy hills. Ovens became the center of bakeries and homes. Trade routes carried wheat across continents so that cities far from farmland could still be fed. Bread helped make urban life possible. It allowed populations to grow, supported workers through long days of labor, and provided a dependable source of energy for millions of people. In many places, the availability of bread became a measure of stability itself. At the same time, bread remained deeply personal. Families baked it in their kitchens. Communities gathered around shared ovens. The smell of bread baking often meant that a meal was near and that a household would be nourished. Across cultures, offering bread to a guest became a sign of hospitality and welcome. Even today, bread carries those quiet meanings. It appears in everyday routines. Toast in the morning, sandwiches at midday, bread served beside dinner. Though modern life has introduced countless new foods and conveniences, bread still holds a familiar place at the table. What is perhaps most fascinating about the history of bread is how slowly it developed. There was no single inventor of bread. Instead, it emerged gradually from the experiments and observations of countless people across thousands of years. Someone discovered grinding grain. Someone else noticed that dough left to rest would rise. Others improved ovens, milling methods, and farming techniques. Each small improvement added another layer to the tradition. Over time, those layers formed a food so reliable and adaptable that it spread across nearly every agricultural society on Earth. Today, bread exists in many forms. Industrial bakeries produce loaves that feed large populations efficiently. Artisan bakers continue older methods that highlight slow fermentation and traditional grains. Home bakers mix dough in their kitchens, rediscovering the quiet satisfaction of turning flour and water into something warm and nourishing. Despite all these differences, the essence of bread remains unchanged. Flour, water, salt, and fermentation still form its foundation. The same basic process that sustained ancient farmers continues to nourish modern families. When we look at a loaf of bread today, it may seem simple, even ordinary. But inside that loaf is a story that stretches across thousands of years. It is the story of fields and harvests, of mills and ovens, of patience and shared knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Bread reminds us that civilization itself is built slowly. It grows through repeated acts of care, planting, grinding, kneading, baking, performed by ordinary people over long stretches of time. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden in the slow history of bread. Some of humanity's most important achievements are not the loudest or the most dramatic. They are the ones that become part of daily life, so familiar that we almost stop noticing them. Bread is one of those achievements. A simple loaf on a table, warm and ready to be shared, carrying within it the long and patient story of human survival, cooperation, and creativity.